Chapter 7. Sovereigns and Shadows. The rain poured relentlessly against Prince Tepid's castle, filling the grand meeting hall with its soggy, persistent presence. Oswald, the steward of Nausea, sat at a small desk at the far end. This was set a little to the left at the foot of a dais. A large throne stood empty in its centre. Oswald sat in a much smaller seat, his nose gently resting on his steepled fingers. Every few seconds his eyes would flick to the impressive doors at the other end of the hall. It had been 8 days. 8 very carefully handled days. Now, at last, they were drawing to a close. Any minute now he was going to lift the weight of the city off his shoulders and hand it back to his sovereign. Oswald cared very deeply about doing a good job. He knew how important it was, how he was definitely the best for the task. It was simply the task itself, its enormity. It loomed over him like thunderclouds, and it scared him. He knew he could do it, but at the same time a small part of him barely believed he could. It wouldn't be long. A pile of orders, summons, agreements, declarations and decisions were signed and stacked neatly beside him, in alphanumerical order. There was still spare ink in the top drawer. Each day's problems had been addressed by lunchtime and put to bed before dinner. Tepid's fish had been fed, their glass home had been cleaned. Oswald hadn't even got his sleeves wet. He'll be here soon. The rain fell harder than ever. Oswald glanced at the windows. Perhaps he should have them cleaned? Footsteps were approaching. He looked back to the doors. It was definitely footfalls, not just the rain. Slowly he stood up and tucked his chair under the desk. The footsteps stopped for a moment. Then the door handle turned. Oswald stood in front of the dais, the large throne standing behind him as the errand runner hurried up the length of the hall, stopping before him to bow. Oswald returned their bow and patiently waited for them to straighten their coat and catch their breath.
"So, His Highness wasn't on the ship,"
said Oswald. The errand runner shook their heads silently, their eyes wide.
"The sailors were flummoxed and came back to notify us?"
Mortified nodding.
"Is there more?"
A pause, followed by a slower, mortified nodding. 3 more people entered the hall, unannounced. Oswald looked up to face them, steeling himself for a moment as they strode towards them. Their long cloaks of deep reds and purples glimmered as silver sequins caught the candlelight. One held a folded map, covered in elaborate and illegible images, and their graceful faces were plastered with sodden auburn hair. They bowed, and, once again, Oswald followed suit.
"Greetings, long-expected guests,"
he said steadily.
"We have come as agreed,"
said the first emissary.
"As citizens of the Kingdom of Glass Mountains, we have travelled from our high home to your city, to meet and escort your lord, Prince Tepid, to our homeland for the long-awaited meeting with our queen."
The errand runner trembled, their eyes dancing from the newcomers to Oswald and back. Oswald smiled.
"You are very welcome here, honoured guests. Unfortunately, we have come up against a small problem."
That particular morning was remarkably beautiful. It looked as if it had been painted over the sea as the little ship traced its way through the chilly waters. Its crew had been working very hard, putting themselves as far away from Shnoema as possible. Luckily, the Shnomen were not great seafarers, and after an hour the sailors' fears of being pursued were gradually extinguished. The failed notions would have given anything to have been out on deck in the pale sunlight. It was so rare for the rain to pause and the sun to come out. But they were all shut below. Honno, Abrian and Ie were still in their dresses. Morphea and Gina were dripping wet, and Delilah was nursing a glorious bruise from a Shnomen missile. Dominator and Annie were keeping a diplomatic distance from the others. They had almost laughed themselves silly at the sight of the dresses and hadn't quite recovered. Captain Oola had not been impressed by the previous night's adventure. Although he paced and spoke as calmly as ever, none of them were left in any doubt that he was very, very angry.
"And why did you decide to steal from them?"
"We did no such thing,"
said Honno indignantly.
You're wearing their clothes,
said Oola icily.
We had to wear something,
spluttered Abrion.
They took ours. Besides, we can just send these ones back.
And who will do that?
Asked Oola.
Will you swim there? I will not spare a single member of my crew. No Nossian will be able to go anywhere near the Schnooman after what you've done.
This wasn't Honno or Abrion or EA's fault, objected Dominator, standing as tall as he could. They can't help it if they do something stupid. There's nothing else to say. Morphea stepped in before 3 very angry failed notions could reach Dominator. I don't think we need to waste any more time talking this over, do we? Captain Oola turned to Morphea, looking suddenly rather dangerous.
You,
he said,
are the one with nothing else to say. You have said and done quite enough.
Oh, have I? Asked Morphea.
You had no right to face down those Schnoomen. You had no right to disregard direct orders not to engage with them. You had no right to endanger your friends and my crew by behaving so stupidly.
I was protecting my friends. There's a difference, Morphea growled.
You put yourself and your friends in danger when they came to fetch you off that ice,
said Oola, his voice becoming deadly soft.
There is no honour in being reckless.
Morphea said nothing, but glowered back unblinkingly. Oola continued pacing up and down between the cabins.
I would not have endorsed this mission if I'd known field nations were such a liability. When you were told to do something better than patronising, complaining or reading, it was not this.
That's a little harsh, muttered G.A. It's not like we didn't do anything to fix it.
You had all the time in the world to let us know what was happening. Instead, we all stayed up through the night waiting for you,
said Oola, glaring at G.A.
I'm not above believing ghosts are bad luck. I thoroughly hope you prove me wrong.
G.A. shut his mouth. It was no use talking back, but there was a lot he would have liked to say. He's not bad luck, cut in Delilah. We were just unlucky.
On the contrary, Miss Delilah, we are all very lucky.
Oola flashed a merciless smile.
Since this incident has happened so far abroad, and if the Schnoomen hopefully do nothing in retaliation, the Prince and Nossia need never know about this. I have enough trouble on this ship without the city getting involved. And I do not need any more unhelpful, easily confused, stubborn...
The hatch to the lowest deck was easing open. Oola turned mid-flow, ready to slam it shut, but a hand was in the way. Everyone stared as the hatch inched open, its hinges whining, ever so slowly revealing the unmistakable ginger hair, fine clothes and, albeit sheepish face, of Prince Tepid. For a moment, no one said a word. Oola seemed to have suddenly become part of the woodwork. He did not move an inch.
Ta-da!
Said Tepid, smiling guiltily. He looked rather ruffled, as though he had not had the best night's sleep. His hair, although magnificent as usual, was tousled and clearly longing for a session with its hairnet. As he pulled himself upright out of the hatch, the weak light floating through the portholes illuminated the scuffs and dust that had settled on his beautiful coat. In fact, on closer inspection, he looked distinctly unkempt. Finally, Prince Dominator's incredulity couldn't be held back any longer and expelled itself in the best way it knew. Ha! He quickly clapped his hands to his mouth as his eyes darted gleefully to Oola, who looked thunderstruck.
Perhaps I ought to explain myself,
said Tepid, straightening his lapels and smiling up at the captain.
If you wouldn't mind, sire,
croaked Oola. The roaring anger that had been charging about inside him had suddenly seen it was headed towards a cliff edge and was frantically scrabbling to change direction.
Why are you here?
Spluttered Abrion disbelievingly.
This wasn't any of your doing,
Oola wheeled towards the ATR, the anger gaining a hopeful foothold. "No, it jolly well wasn't," snapped Annie, planting her hands on her hips.
Let me explain,
said Tepid calmly.
The morning we left the Aral Isle to go our separate ways, I decided to take my usual morning stroll. Clears the mind and the breathing, you know. I had headed towards our ships and was so buried in my thoughts, I elected to continue perusing them on board my vessel bound for Nausea. I do confess I must have dozed off. It was quite some time before I woke up and realised I had stepped aboard the wrong ship, and was not on my way home to Nausea, but in the lowest deck of your own very fine ship, headed on your journey to stop the rain. Why didn't you say anything?
Asked Honno, fighting back the almost irresistible urge to laugh.
Oh, I didn't want to cause any fuss,
said Tepid quickly.
You've all been so busy. It looks as if you've already been having some marvellous adventures.
His eyes lingered on the dresses.
Since I was carefully installed out of the way, I resolved to not get under anyone's feet.
So it was you who's been nicking the food, Gina grinned. I told you it wasn't us, Captain. Oola's anger would have dearly liked to pursue this, but the ground beneath its feet was crumbling as Tepid continued.
I did indeed take advantage of the food supplies after the first few days, though my reasoning was, since the food was supplied mostly by the crown wearer ought to be entitled to a morsel or two if push came to shove.
Your Highness,
Oola found himself saying gently.
I can have the ship put about and have you escorted back to Nausea in the wink of an eye.
Is that entirely necessary?
Said Tepid, looking up at him with his round amber eyes.
I mean to say, forgive me for overhearing, but it seems travelling back the way you came is out of the question.
With all due respect, sire.
Oola's every word was handled with desperate delicacy.
I do believe we can take that risk for you.
Tepid chuckled and waved the captain's words aside.
Oh no, I hardly think that's needed, thank you all the same. It would surely be counterproductive to delay your journey any further with trips back to Nausea. Don't you agree?
It was almost as if the ATR could see the captain's resolve being gently pulled out from under his feet. They would have dearly liked to say something, but knew it would be far wiser to stay quiet. Oola's anger was still going to cling on to whatever it could.
Sire, I will not have you subjected to such a journey. You have Nausea to consider. And that meeting you were supposed to...
You're worried about Nausea?
Asked Tepid lightly.
The city is still being taken care of by my dear steward Oswald, who I left in charge. Come to think of it, I'd better send word of my situation, that I'm staying on the journey with the anti-me revolution to, let's say, supervise and provide encouragement. Yes, something like that. Abrian, does your little dragon carry messages?
Abrian jumped at his name being mentioned.
She's not that great at it.
He fumbled with his shawl self-consciously.
She tends to sneeze and burn the messages. Well, not to worry,
smiled Tepid.
I feel assured we will find a solution to that.
Your Highness, you must not, that is to say, I cannot.
Oola stumbled for words that would bring the situation back under his control, but forced composure was peeling the final claws of his anger off the cliff edge one by one.
Yes, Captain?
Said Tepid.
I will see it done, sire.
Oola swept a bow and turned to head down the passageway, his footfall softly thudding away. G.A. couldn't believe what he had seen. Had things got better or worse? At least it seemed they were out of trouble. Gina sneezed. Oola's footsteps paused for a moment. Silence billowed.
Bless you.
The footsteps continued, fading away into the depths of the ship.
Oh, he is nice, isn't he?
Said Tepid happily. Tepid was not best pleased with the sleeping arrangements, but he bore it with good grace. The ship was too small for luxury, and the few individual cabins had already been claimed. The prince had gallantly insisted he would sleep with everyone else and waved aside any mention of sharing the captain's quarters. Everyone else was less keen on one more person taking up valuable space, though they kept quiet. They were still all in shock at his surprise appearance and weren't quite sure if this wasn't some strange practical joke or test. Tepid's gallantry was stretched, however, when he found his hammock had been installed in the far end of the lower deck next to GA and EA. GA certainly knew why Tepid would have liked to keep his distance from them. During their time on the streets of Nausea, GA and EA had once tried to rob the prince. It had not gone well. As Tepid settled into his hammock, GA felt sure he was watching the pair of them warily out of the corner of his eye. The ship's timber frame creaked as the night stretched on. GA felt mentally exhausted. It had been 2 very long days with no sleep in between. On the bright side, at least he wouldn't feel the aches, bruises, or horrible stiffness of his solid companions tomorrow. Another plus side of not having a physical body, he thought with a smile as he drifted into a doze.
Aluiciuous?
GA stirred. Had someone said something? He thoroughly hoped not. He was just falling asleep. He stayed still, half-heartedly listening. There was no sound. It was nothing. GA curled up tighter. It was lovely sleeping in the air. It was always so comfortable.
I say, Aluiciuous, are you awake there?
GA opened his eyes. He was now. He turned over and a small candle flared into life, illuminating Tepid's face in the darkness. Tepid, Your Highness? GA blinked in the spluttering light. In the hammock next to him, EA also sat up, a thick book almost sliding off his lap.
Say, Nail,
he mumbled sleepily. Tepid held the little candle in one hand, holding tight to the swinging cords of his bed with the other. GA and EA exchanged the briefest of glances. It would be in their best interests not to smile. Tepid was obviously not used to hammocks.
Ah, good you're awake,
said the prince, his air of unshakable dignity sounding slightly forced.
I just wanted to... Well, I thought it might be best...
We can move if you don't feel comfortable, said GA immediately, keen to get back to sleep.
My, that's very kind of you to offer,
said Tepid, looking from one to the other.
However, Don't worry, we don't mind,
said EA, making to get up.
I beg your pardon, you misunderstand me, my dear chaps,
Tepid cut in quickly.
I don't need you to move. I merely wanted a short word with you.
With us? Asked GA, perplexed.
Indeed,
said Tepid. He shuffled upright and the hummock swung dangerously.
I wanted to... that is to say... Well, I realise I owe the pair of you an apology,
he said finally. The candle flame flickered. GA and EA stared at the prince. This wasn't what they had been expecting.
As Prince of Nausea, I will never condone robbery,
said Tepid.
It wasn't an experience I look back on fondly. I'm confident the pair of you feel the same by now. Still...
He sighed, his brow furrowed.
I believe what you had to experience to learn that lesson was... disproportionate.
GA didn't say a word. He glanced across to his brother. EA was sat equally still, looking as if he wasn't sure he'd heard Tepid correctly.
I cannot deny that the overall outcome seems to have been very beneficial to you,
Tepid continued.
However, if I had only known, when I had sent you back to Feldnor by force, headlong into a war which was of my own making, if I had known then that you would both meet your ends there...
He looked up at them.
I can assure you I would not have done such a thing.
Neither GA or EA knew what to say. No one had talked to them about their deaths this way, and certainly not with so much remorse. They had always considered it as just one more twist of bad luck in their colourful lives. Now Nausea's prince was sitting in front of them in an unbalanced hammock, and offering them his apology for it. G.A. felt this wasn't the best response, but it was all he could manage. You don't need to say sorry.
I truly thought I ought to,
said Tepid earnestly, his wide eyes flicking between them.
It's been bothering me all night. After all, you didn't do that bad a job of organising the failed notions in that final push. It all turned out all right in the end, even after you booted me out of power.
He smiled genially at them. G.A. smiled back, still not sure if this was some kind of psychological trap. There was a prolonged and awkward silence. Both brothers were privately beginning to hope it would be all right to go back to sleep.
You know, you both look a lot like your father did,
Tepid said at length.
Especially you.
He nodded to E.A.
I think it's the hair.
E.A. dropped his book. G.A. nearly fell out of the air. What did you say? He spluttered.
He was an interesting fellow,
said Tepid conversationally.
I was only very small at the time, but it was always easy to remember a name like young Aluiciuous Maben when you're learning your letters. I often called him Jam,
said E.A., as if suddenly remembering.
It's what he said his name was when we asked if his name was Daddy.
How come you knew him? Asked G.A., gaping at Tepid.
Ah, well, this would have been before your time,
said Tepid, looking rather smug.
My father, the King of Nausea, you know, had a large number of ambassadors and consuls and whatnot from all sorts of lands hanging about our castle. Back when Failnor was still under Nausean authority, it was quite common to have a number of failed notions consulting on important matters. I believe your father used to work for my father for quite a while.
Our father? A diplomat? Asked G.A. incredulously.
I think his department was more focused around magic and its applications, actually.
Tepid corrected him, twiddling his forelock around his fingers.
I would occasionally bump into him on my potterings about the corridors. You have to understand that being an only child means one sometimes got a little short of things to do. But Jam was always very accommodating and allowed me to observe while he worked on his various theorems, even letting me be involved sometimes.
I bet he did, muttered G.A. and E.A. Their father would never had said no to a willing test subject.
Of course, that was before he got in trouble with my father,
the prince carried on.
I wasn't allowed to visit him after that. He was often in the dungeons under guard, anyway.
He noticed the brothers exchange a look of surprise.
Oh, yes, we have a dungeon in my castle,
he added gleefully. What did our father do to get into trouble? Asked G.A., knowing there was a very broad spectrum of exactly what Jam could have done. Tepid shrugged.
I don't recall. After some time I heard he escaped. I didn't really take any notice. Presumably he went back to Failnor and found somebody nice, etc., etc. Of course, he was brought back eventually and then stayed in our castle under my father's supervision. Then the war happened and then that funny incident. I suppose you know all the rest.
He yawned.
Oh dear, I must have kept you up for so long. I do apologise. I will bid you a good...
We don't know all the rest, said G.A. immediately. Both he and E.A. were wide awake now. Tepid looked at them, slightly perplexed.
I thought he would have relayed all this to you both.
No! The twins shook their heads. Tepid chuckled sleepily.
Fancy that. He always was a funny fellow. Good night, chaps.
And he blew out the candle and settled back into his hammock, leaving G.A. and E.A. in the darkness. Far away in the depths of Failnor, night was settling across the tree-laden landscape. A ripple shuddered across the fabric of reality, as if someone hiding behind a curtain had shifted slightly. All remained still as if nothing had happened. The White Queen calmly sat at the base of a wide birch tree that was draped in the sleepy blue shadows of night. The rain drizzled all around, though somehow not a single drop seemed to land on the Queen herself. Slowly, without shaking a leaf, a patch of darkness emerged into the scene, like a chink of light turned inside out. It grew until it formed an opening as tall as a doorway. 2 little lights blinked nervously as they looked out at the White Queen. She did not move from her seat, but gazed straight back with determinedly polite eyes. The lights blinked again and tried to act natural.
"We see you anticipated our arrival."
The White Queen's strangely long eyebrows twitched as if to say, "Obviously." The lights hesitated a little before continuing.
"We would like to clarify we mean no harm."
The White Queen's eyebrows twitched again.
"Of course, not that we could ever be capable of harming you,"
the lights added hastily.
"You have demonstrated substantial strength before us, and we Netherwatchers humbly extend our gratitude to you for tolerating our recent intrusion into the living world so mercifully."
The unblinking gaze of the White Queen told them to get to the point.
"The balance we protect has begun to be restored since the removal of the troubled being, the one afflicted with black magic. His death has been exceedingly beneficial after the strains upon the fabric of reality."
The lights paused. The White Queen's eyes warned the Netherwatchers they were treading on sensitive ground, but allowed them to continue. If the lights had feet, they would have shuffled them.
"And yet..."
The lights took a moment to gather their words. Clearly this was the crux of the matter, and the reason they had cautiously entered into the White Queen's territory.
"We cannot ignore the damage that has been inflicted on the fabric of reality through the deeds of certain individuals."
They shrank back a little as the White Queen sat up straighter, and her eyes shone briefly with a fire from within.
"Who are of course completely under your protection,"
the lights added quickly. A second pair of lights appeared beside the first, which looked very relieved for the support.
"As long as the peoples you guard are always reminded not to rip the borders between our worlds,"
they declared,
"we have no need to interfere as we did before. They must learn the fabric of reality is a carefully woven veil, separating the necessary realms of life. It may seem strong, but the more it is meddled with, the harder it is to mend."
The White Queen blinked slowly, as if to say, "And?" More metaphorical foot shuffling went on in the darkness.
"It has to be said, two ghosts in the land of living does put a significant strain on things."
The White Queen drew herself up to her full height. The gaze which she fixed on the Netherwatchers made their little gleams of light shrink like snails into their shells.
"You will not touch them,"
she said at last.
"We beseech you. We did not intend to anger you,"
said the first lights tremulously.
"We are aware one such ghost is of your blood. We would not separate parent from child, but the second is of no connection to you. We would beg you to hear us. We propose a trade."
The White Queen's gaze didn't falter, but waited and watched. The second pair of lights disappeared for a moment. There was a muffled yelp from somewhere unseen in the darkness. The first set of lights hovered by the opening, anxiously glancing between the White Queen and their unseen cohort. A few moments later the second lights reappeared, and with them was a figure bound in black chains. They struggled fiercely against the bonds, complaining loudly as they were pulled along by unseen hands. As they struggled, one of their legs snagged on the edge of the opening. Whoever it was tumbled backwards and landed hard at the White Queen's feet.
"And your taste in decorating appalls me. Ouch!"
The White Queen looked carefully at the heap at her feet. His white tail, dipped in black at the end, flicked nervously as he looked up into her face.
Oh,
he said miserably. The White Queen gazed at him thoughtfully, then looked back to the Nether Watchers. With one swift wave of her hand, the black chains around the figure crumbled. Both sets of lights looked mightily pleased.
We thank you for your wise decision,
they said.
After all, we are on the same side. It is only right that we should aid one another when necessary.
But the White Queen didn't seem to be listening. She was far more interested in the figure on the ground. The lights paused and exchanged a brief glance.
White Queen, do you accept our offering?
The White Queen had picked up the figure and set him unsteadily upright. She watched as he wobbled a little and tested the ground with his feet. His eyes darted between the Queen and the dark opening suspiciously. The White Queen smiled and placed a hand on his head as he staggered.
This fell notion is mine,
she said.
And the ghost?
asked the lights eagerly, but the White Queen had begun to stride away.
White Queen?
She stopped and gazed at them over her shoulder.
He is mine.
He should be ours. We agreed to trade.
But the White Queen shook her head.
Honour your words. You do not separate parents from children.
The ghost is no relation to you,
said the lights angrily.
He is to his father,
said the White Queen, her eyes twinkling. The figure next to her looked up, confused. The White Queen turned away and continued walking, leaving the frustrated lights dangling in the opening.
Very well,
they said at length, their tone venomous.
It shall be so. But be warned, the fabric of reality is fragile. It has not been fully mended. There are more serious threats than ghosts to contain within it. The living world should be cautious.
The White Queen spun about and, with 2 long strands of magic, seized the corners of the opening. Suddenly, her face was directly in front of the little lights.
As should you. Cease talking and perform the duty charged to you.
And she pulled the opening shut, leaving nothing but the silent evening air where it had been. The newcomer stood watching her nervously. He backed away as she approached, but she passed him by and continued heading back into the forest. He hesitated, looking back at where the Nether Watchers had been.
Are you finished?
He called after the White Queen, but she didn't break her stride. Glancing one last time at the clearing behind him, the newcomer followed her, trotting unsteadily.
Are you acting so mysteriously on purpose, or is this a habit?
He said, brushing aside soggy ferns and adding,
By the way, where am I?
The White Queen didn't answer. The newcomer felt sure this was deliberate, but didn't want to be left on his own. It was a long, silent walk. The White Queen didn't pause or look back. It wasn't clear if she meant for him to go his own way now, or if she was just allowing him to stay and walk with her. His legs felt sore and wobbly back in the living world. He stumbled and slipped over on his ankles. His coat snagged on brambles which scratched his hands. After some time, however, his feet slowly became accustomed to the feel of the ground beneath them. He staggered less and wondered if it had something to do with the fluffy thing waving around behind him. When he remembered, that was what his tail was for. Elements of the land of the living were reintroducing themselves to him. The feeling of rough, cold bark, chilly rainwater, and the roaring, rushing sound of the wind nesting in the treetops. At last he saw she had stopped and was watching him as he caught up with her. He strode over to where she stood, looked about, and then back at her.
You've stopped.
The White Queen raised her eyebrows. He was observant. He waited for her to say something, but she simply looked right back at him. As his eyes became used to the dark, he noticed a distinct shape amongst the trees. Intrigued, he found himself walking forwards. A stream was somewhere close by. It sounded like it was overflowing. The earth beneath his feet undulated and churned as he trod on saturated, marshy soil. The shape ahead of him was gently illuminated by the glow of the White Queen as she followed him. A glassless window peered from a wall like an eyeless socket. The walls were tired and cracked. Ivy, creepers and roots had taken their place supporting a skeleton of timbers. The stone felt hollow and empty. The newcomer stooped a little, avoiding the sodden roots, and saw a black opening in the stone where a door hung limply. Something inside him flickered as he touched its frame and squinted in. The shell of the little house had let in the rain and the forest. Leaves were strewn over the floor. The ceiling was blackened and mould spread everywhere. There was as much outdoors inside this room as there was outside. Shadows of neglect seeped from every corner as his eyes fell on what had once been a chair, bottles, cabinets, all decaying, eaten by time. The White Queen remained in the doorway, watching as he stepped over the debris to a hearth choked with damp ash. Beside this was a mess of charred papers, broken jars filled with dirt and crumbling books. A peculiar feeling was growing within him as he knelt down and pulled something out from the pile and held it to the light. It was a small shoe. It seemed to hold most of the peculiar feeling that was filling him. The White Queen stayed still as he turned to look at her.
Where am I?
He asked again, quieter this time.
You are home,
she replied. He said nothing, his mind moving quickly. He looked back at the shoe in his hands, then carefully stood up.
Why am I here?
The White Queen smiled.
Why indeed, my dear young Aluiciuous?